We've been wrong about valgus knees in the squat. For years, the fitness industry has treated knee valgus in the squat as a clear technical mistake. It's where the knees cave in, and the standard explanation has usually been weak glutes. And I used to say that too. So the obvious corrective cue for this was to scream knees out and include a ton of glute strengthening exercises to correct that weakness. And for some reason, no matter how loud we scream or how much glute work we prescribe, it never fixed the problem. If we look at elite athletes performing maximal lifts, we see knee valgus appear in lifts performed by some of the strongest athletes in the world. It will be very difficult to argue that these athletes have weak glutes. So if knee valgus isn't just weak glutes, what's actually happening? Another concept sometimes used to explain knee valgus is the role of the adductor magnus. Many experts point out that the adductors become powerful hip extensors in deep hip flexion. As the lifter begins to stand up from the bottom of a squat, the adductors extend the hip while simultaneously producing hip adduction. This can contribute to knees moving inwards. This explanation has some merit, but like the weak glute explanation, it's too simplified to fully explain what's happening. To understand knee valgus properly, we need to look at the entire system. Before going further, we need to distinguish between two very different situations that are often grouped together. The first is true knee collapse. This is when the knees suddenly and excessively cave inward because the lifter has lost tension and coordination. The load is too heavy and the system breaks down. This is clearly a technical problem and should be corrected, probably starting with reducing the weight. The second situation is very different. At the highest levels of lifting, we sometimes see small, controlled inward movement of the knees while the lifter maintains full control of the lift. This is not a collapse. It's a coordinated movement pattern occurring under very high loads. This discussion is referring to that second scenario. Here's a video of one of the world's best weightlifters, Xiaojun, with a world record clean and jerk of 207 kilograms. When we look at the lift from the front view, we can see a small amount of knee valgus as he begins standing up with the bar. It happens a little bit with the clean, and then it happens a little bit more with the overhead squat, which makes sense because an overhead squat is a lot harder than the front squat. At first glance, this appears to confirm the traditional belief that the knees are collapsing. But when we examine the lift from the side view, we see the hips moving further back, which is paired with the torso leaning slightly forward, and an increase of hip flexion before extension begins. This is all a strategy to allow the lifter to call on the glutes to help lift the weight. If it didn't happen, the torso would remain upright. His hips would have stayed under the bar, which would have meant that there was no moment arm being created at the hip joint, and therefore very little contribution by the hips to get that weight up. Or in other words, it would have been all quads. If this happened, his knees would have also tracked in perfect alignment with his feet, which you'll see with the lighter weights. But as it's an absolute max and a world record, his quads alone are unlikely to be enough to complete the lift. So what appears to be knee collapse from the front view is actually part of a coordinated reorganization of the entire system, allowing the lifter to recruit the hips more aggressively to complete that lift. The knees are not collapsing, they're reacting to what the hips are doing. We need to understand there's more than one correct squat technique. Different lifters with different goals solve the squat using different strategies. Some lifters prioritize mechanical leverage. Two examples are literally the best powerlifters in our history, the GOAT, Ed Cohen, and the current strongest powerlifter on the planet, Colton Engelbrecht. When they squat, we see zero knee valgus. These powerlifters have a different squat strategy. They use a wider stance and a more open hip position, along with different bracing strategy. This allows the femur to remain externally rotated and abducted while still achieving the required depth for the sport, which is an important factor because powerlifters don't need to achieve the same ass to grass depth that we see in weightlifting, nor do they need to finish the lift with the weight over their heads. And this changes the position of the pelvis as well as the way that we use our hips. From the side view, this strategy keeps the hips closer to the bar and reduces the hip moment arm, allowing the lifter to distribute the work efficiently across the entire system. Of course, the glutes are still working, but the objective is not to isolate them. The objective is to use the entire body as efficiently as possible to move the heaviest load from point A to point B. Weightlifters use a different approach. Because they must receive the bar extremely deep in the clean or the snatch, their goal is to descend as deep as possible so they can catch the heaviest weight. The deeper the lifter can receive the bar, the less height they must pull it. To support the bar in this position, weightlifters typically brace with a more extended spine, more elevated ribs, a more anteriorly rotated pelvis. This bracing strategy also helps support the bar overhead, but it changes the way that the femur behaves inside the hip joint. When the pelvis is more anteriorly tilted and the lifter attempts to achieve maximal squat depth, the femur often moves into internal rotation as the hip flexes further. This allows the hip joint to achieve the additional flexion required to reach the deepest possible squat position. Externally, this can appear as the knees drifting slightly inward. This is one reason controlled knee valgus is commonly observed in elite weightlifting. Powerlifters, on the other hand, don't need to reach this extreme depth. The sport only requires the crease of the hip to pass below the top of the knee. Because the depth requirement is not as deep, the same degree of internal rotation is typically not required. Both strategies can produce extremely strong squats. They simply solve the mechanical problem in different ways. Another piece of the puzzle involves understanding how the muscle generates force through tension. A simple way of explaining this is by using calf training as an example, looking at the gastrocnemius muscle. The primary role of the gastrocnemius is plantar flexion of the ankle. But because the gastrocnemius crosses the knee joint, it also contributes to knee flexion. If the knee is bent, slack is introduced into the muscle and its ability to produce strong plantar flexion is reduced. This is why we perform standing calf raises when we want to train the gastrocnemius. By keeping the knee extended, we place tension on the muscle before the contraction occurs. Another way of thinking of it is to consider that the way that we increase tension on the muscle is to put it in the position that we would stretch the muscle. When we perform seated calf raise with the knee bent, the gastrocnemius is shortened and its contribution is reduced. This shifts the emphasis towards the soleus, which only crosses the ankle joint. Or in other words, by changing the joint position, we change how much tension is placed on the muscle before it contracts. The same principle applies to the glutes. The gluteus maximus contributes to hip extension, hip abduction, and hip external rotation. If you put this all together, it's basically the start position of a wide stance squat, or the end position in a sumo deadlift. And this is essentially placing the glutes in the most shortened and contracted position. To maximize tension on the glutes, we need to do the opposite of that: flexion, adduction, and internal rotation. When you look at the bottom position of a squat when valgus knees has occurred, it starts to make sense. This increases the tension in the glutes before hip extension begins. Hip flexion is the largest contributor to increasing glute tension, but the abduction and internal rotation components also play a role. When the hips move back further behind the line of force during a squat or a hinge pattern, hip flexion increases and the glutes are placed under greater tension before the extension phase begins. This is why movements such as Romanian deadlifts or narrow stance low bar squats, where the lifter is typically cued to push the hips back, produces a strong glute stimulus. This understanding also helps explain something many lifters experience. Some lifters adopt a wide stance and are constantly cued to push the knees out. No matter how often they hear the cue, their knees continue to drift inward. In many cases, this is not because they lack the strength. It's because their body is trying to reorganize the movement. When the stance doesn't match the lifter's mechanics, the hips often shoot back, increasing hip flexion and increasing the demand on the glutes. From the perspective of the pelvis, the knees travel inward as the system attempts to recruit the hips more aggressively. In this situation, continuing to cue knees out may simply be trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. A more effective solution may be to slightly narrow the stance and reduce how much the toes are pointing outwards. This allows the lifter to maintain a more stacked position where the foot, knee, and hip remain aligned, while still allowing the hips to contribute strongly to the lift. This discussion also provides insight into how the glutes can be trained more effectively. In strength sports like powerlifting, the goal of the squat is to move the heaviest load possible. Lifters organize their body in a way that maximizes mechanical efficiency and distributes the load across the entire system. Bodybuilding approaches the problem differently. The goal is not simply to lift the heaviest weight. The goal is to place the target muscle under the greatest amount of tension. Movements that create greater hip flexion and larger hip moment arms place the glutes under greater tension before the extension phase begins. This is why exercises such as Romanian deadlift and narrow stance squats often produce a stronger glute stimulus than wider stance movements with a more upright torso angle. Understanding this distinction helps explain why the best strategy for lifting the most weight is not always the same strategy that maximizes muscular development. For years, the strength industry treated knee valgus as a simple technical mistake caused by weak glutes. But both the research and the mechanics suggest something more complex. Sometimes knee valgus is a loss of control, but sometimes it simply reflects how the body reorganizes itself to recruit the hips more aggressively when the load becomes very high. Understanding that difference allows coaches and lifters to move beyond rigid cues and instead choose the strategy that best fits their goals and their individual mechanics. Knee valgus is not always ideal, but it's also not always the problem that we once thought it was.